Hello, Huples Cat. Welcome to Lecture 3 in the great course on disaster preparedness. If you do not see a hazard before it happens, then you obviously can't get ready mentally or get preps in to deal with it. Worse, if the hazard happens that you haven't foreseen, responding to it is going to be really difficult. However, if you do identify a hazard but fail to prep, responding to it is also going to be difficult. So without further ado, let's get to Lecture 3.
Disaster preparedness can be a really big topic. It can generate laundry lists of thou shalts and thou shalt nots. Do this, but don't do that, with items that may seem at first glance to bear little relationship to one another.
Sounds familiar, eh? The 100% certainty that you find on some prepper channels is actually a cover for them not being very open or flexible in terms of response. Yes, if you let others into your house and share what you have in disaster, they may well kill you and take everything for themselves. Or not. These strangers that you're helping out might end up being the nucleus of a really strong and important group for you. It is always going to be ambiguous. It is always going to be uncertain. Despite the certainty, some people like to pretend exists.
In fact, this is one barrier to effective preparedness. Looking at everything and saying, that? You expect me to do all of that? I've got to set up a foolproof communication system and put in storm shutters and get certified in first aid and find a shelter and make sure it's one that allows pets and keep a map of evacuation routes and look at a flood profile map and know how far I am from the nearest volcano and keep a basket of supplies but find somewhere it won't get crushed if there's a tornado and go meet my local police officers and figure out where grandma can temporarily live. It's enough to make you want to shrug your shoulders and say, enough is enough.
How many "what do I have in my bug out bag" videos can you actually watch? The truth is, as many as you can. Always look for things that help or give you fresh ideas on what you're doing. Watching the same old and coming away with it going, I'm prepped 100%, is actually a bad idea. If you're seeing videos and you're watching channels that 100% tell you that what you've done is exactly right, and your attitude is exactly right, be warned, you're actually in a bubble. Get out there, open up and become more flexible in your prepping and in the choice of information you use to prep with. If you're going to prep by training or reading or watching or accumulating stuff, or hopefully all four things, do a little bit, but do it often.
The two documents I'm going to focus on in this presentation are the National Preparedness Goal and the Preparedness Cycle.
These are United States of American government documents. Other countries have similar or don't. You'll have to look for your own country's stuff.
There are three things that I'd like to challenge you to do in this lecture that are all related to FEMA's doctrines. First, review your jurisdiction's documents that outline known hazards in your area.
These are the great province of Ontario's documents, fairly broad because Ontario is as big as England and France combined, and is quite different from Toronto to Thunder Bay. You have to look for local information as much as you can. The provincial, state and national is a good place to go for broad lenses of hazards.
Second, start to make notes about how you can extend your preparedness for a disaster beyond the plans we've already discussed.
I must admit, a prepper journal is very useful. Years ago when I started prepping, I actually started jotting down stuff that I was watching and reading, and it helped me. I didn't do it in a formalized way like this, but I think he's right and I think you should consider it.
Third, use the FEMA preparedness cycle to start building out and testing your plans.
Use this or something similar. Basically, identify hazards, get stuff and training to mitigate them or avoid them entirely if preferable, and practice using the skills and the stuff you have in the scenarios as realistically as you can to an actual hazard event, and then reevaluate what happened. Practice, reevaluate, think.
The Cascadia Subduction Zone. Heard of it? If so, you're up on your geology. Stretching along the shoreline of Washington State, Oregon, and Northern California, the zone is one marked by the potential for earthquake activity. As you may know, the field of plate tectonics is based on the discovery that a series of plates make up the upper layer of the Earth's crust, or lithosphere. For lack of a better word, these plates float on the Earth's mantle, the layer beneath. The plates are continuously in motion, although it's so slow that we can't naturally perceive it.
In 1915, Albert Wegener actually figured this out.
But it's this movement that leads to volcanic activity, to earthquakes, and indirectly to tsunamis.
Of course, if you think the Earth is flat or is 6,000 years old, you can basically ignore a lot of this type of information and a lot of prepping information.
A tsunami isn't what is often portrayed in the popular media, and especially movies. It's not a 20-foot tall tidal wave that crashes into the shoreline, although the eventual flood depths from a tsunami can reach and even exceed that level. Instead, by appearance, it looks like a rising flood that simply won't stop.
This is a really great description of a tsunami.
One cause for a tsunami, though there are others, is an undersea earthquake, which displaces enough water to cause tsunami waves that progressively inundate the coastline. So, the location I mentioned, the coastline of Washington State, Oregon, and Northern California, this is called a subduction zone. What's happening is the plate beneath the Pacific Ocean, it's the Juan de Fuca plate, is being pushed against the shoreline and is being subducted or pushed beneath the North American plate. This stores up a lot of energy, and when the friction no longer holds, a large earthquake, over 8.0 on the Richter scale, which is among the largest that could occur. Subduction zones are known for generating devastating earthquakes and tsunamis. What would happen if a devastating earthquake struck this area?
Although you can really see why Hollywood likes to have huge mega waves hitting London, New York, and LA, and the Golden Gate Bridge. It's very dramatic. But in reality, it's a flood that comes and comes and comes and comes and does not stop, and quite quickly. But generally speaking, there will be waves in some areas, but just having no wave, no water, and a huge wave is really, really unlikely. It can happen upland, up rivers from the ocean, so be wary of that. Channeling events.
Geologists Donald and David Hinman describe it as follows, and this is a quote: "The subduction zone off the coast of Washington and Oregon is like a tightly drawn bow waiting to be unleashed." Now imagine a coastal town, quiet, a peaceful day, ocean breeze, the cry of seagulls, and then earthquake. Not just any earthquake, a mega earthquake. And just as residents are starting to realize what happened and beginning their rescue and response efforts, a tsunami begins to make its way ashore. Even if the earthquake was smaller or further away, the impact of a tsunami could still be devastating. In some communities, tsunami depths could reach 40 feet of water. Even the tallest buildings would be inundated. I'd like to give you an example of what can happen. Tsunami inundation maps are prepared for communities along the coast. These maps are publicly available. Oregon publishes them to raise awareness and to assist in emergency preparedness and planning. If there was an 8.9 earthquake, that's huge, unleashing approximately 32 times more energy than the legendary 1906 San Francisco quake, but entirely possible in a subduction zone. It would generate a medium tsunami, which maps show would include most coastal buildings. Flooding would be 10 to 35 feet deep, reaching its maximum point within 30 to 45 minutes of the earthquake.
Here is one for southern British Columbia. There are an awful lot of people living, working, and having recreation in the zones affected. The loss of life and property damage would be era-defining.
Just by virtue of the geography, a lot of critical facilities, including police stations, fire stations, schools, medical facilities, and more, could be underwater within the tsunami inundation zone. And I hope this never happens, but geologically, it has to be on the radar as a potential threat, even if by statistical averages, it could still be a few hundred years before the area experiences an earthquake that large.
This type of an event, this type of hazard is low to medium probability, but the impact is massive, with a massive, colossal impact. Even if it's very low probability of happening, you should have at least done some thinking in detail and researching in detail about what to do if that unlikely but massive event happens. When of course I say unlikely, tsunamis and earthquakes are actually definitely going to happen.
What do you think are the challenges that would be involved in preparing for this type of incident?
Getting people to take all of this seriously beforehand, having adequate evacuation routes and having adequate notice to everybody are going to be really, really difficult to achieve. I would always assume worst case, so I would assume that the first notice of this was 3 a.m. on Christmas morning, and it hit by 4 a.m. Christmas morning.
Okay, I know that question could take the rest of our time here in this lecture.
Great!
So let me ask another question. What would be your top 10 preparations? Where would you even begin?
You got to know it's happened, and then you've got to communicate it to everybody, and then there's a whole bunch of other things that would follow from that.
Without structure, these questions can be mind-boggling. So let's turn to the FEMA doctrines that can help us out a bit and take a look at the recipe they provide. When President Obama took office, he issued Homeland Security Presidential Policy Directive Number 8 in 2011. This document called for the creation of a national preparedness goal. Later that year, the national preparedness goal itself was released.
Hey American subscribers, you all know what it is, right?
A secure and resilient nation with the capabilities required across the whole community to prevent, protect against, mitigate, respond to, and recover from the threats and hazards that pose the greatest risk.
Cool. What you should do, what I would do here, is swap the word nation for me and mine, you and yours. Use these big overarching preparedness documents and ideas, trim them down, fit them for your own personal home and family.
The focus is on the threats and hazards that pose the greatest risk. This means that we shouldn't just randomly assume what threats a given location is going to experience. Instead, we should study the location to understand what threats are actually likely to occur there.
This document is one more near to where I actually live currently, and the major threats are floods blocking roads and wildfires destroying housing and of course roads. And to some degree I would say ice storms. It is actually a common event here, but what we're talking about to make it a disaster would be actually widespread. So it's not just 2 or 3 roads are flushed out by a storm, it's 50 to 100 of the roads are out and there's widespread trees down.
So how do we know what the key threats are in a location? The answer lies in 2 documents, which are often combined into one. The first is a threat and hazard identification and risk assessment, commonly known by its acronym THIRA. It is, or at least should be, the result of a scientific study of the location to map known hazards, and it's usually completed by a planning commission or the emergency management office for your area. The second is what's called a hazard mitigation plan, which explores actions related to each hazard identified that can reduce their impacts or enhance safety.
This is Ontario's. It's far too broad to be locally useful, but it is an interesting read. If you have any interesting links, please feel free to put them in the comment. This channel allows links.
I find that this helps to focus discussions of preparedness by saying, look, here are the things that should be first and foremost on your mind. And you know, if you're prepared for those, that will translate to other things that could come up. Contact your local emergency management office and ask to see these documents. They really can help you identify the kinds of things to prepare for as you start thinking about your own personal preparedness.
Reading widely on disasters and preparedness is actually always going to yield you more information and be much more valuable for the time invested than watching YouTube videos. That said, I am IMS certified and I used to do risk management as an integral part of my managerial job working nights at a major teaching hospital. I know I'm not an expert in this, but I can tell you there's a lot on YouTube who say that they're experts who frankly aren't.
For those threats, we need to prevent, protect against, mitigate, respond, and recover.
The 5 steps.
Preparedness asks the question, are we ready to respond if this were to happen? If there was a tsunami, what would we need to do? Help me out with some ideas. Here are some that come to mind. First, the public needs to know when there's a risk of tsunami occurring, particularly if it results from something other than an earthquake in the immediate area. Next, if that happens, the main thing to do is get out of the area, so an evacuation plan is critical. This means we need to know evacuation routes, and to evacuate, transportation needs to be available.
To answer a question I posed quite a bit beforehand, prepping is emergency preparedness. Emergency preparedness is prepping. But in general, prepping is about the individual rather than the local area and the nation state. whereas emergency preparedness tends to be something people do as a collective. That's being very generalized on that one.
Remember the 4 questions from our first lecture? How will you receive alerts and warnings? What is your shelter plan? What is your evacuation route? What is your communication plan?
These 4 questions require realistic and specific answers, or you are not a preparedness individual, you are not prepping. You might have a lot of stuff, you might have watched a lot of videos, but if you cannot sit down and write out simply and specifically answers to those 4 questions, you are not in any way ready for any sort of actual emergency.
Mitigation asks the question, if this incident was to occur someday, is there anything we could do now to minimize the damage?
Clearly, though, if you live in a British Columbia beach house, you need to sell up, cash out, and move as far away from the tide line from a huge tsunami and earthquake zone as you can. That's preparing for a tsunami in British Columbia if you live and work on the beach. Anything other than that is mitigation. The go back, etc., and all that stuff, water in the house, that is all going to be mitigation.
This isn't about being ready to take action. That's preparedness. Instead, mitigation is about what kind of damage controls can we put into place to reduce harms.
Creating pre-existing flood barriers on your land is mitigation.
Mitigation is expensive, especially for a tsunami. But for other types of disasters, individuals can do mitigation. Hurricane shutters for windows, generators in case the power goes out, a flu shot in case the flu reaches pandemic levels. These are all other examples of mitigation.
Bear in mind this lecture series was filmed in 2018 and not 2021. My responses are in 2021, I think. However, using COVID-19 as the hazard, having a vaccination and wearing a mask and washing your hands and keeping socially distanced are all mitigation rather than preparedness. Preparedness would be having urinals in the house so you can actually be in bed sick with COVID-19 and use a urinal rather than try to stagger to the bathroom. Little tiny things that you can do make you much more likely to survive and be comfortable in an emergency.
While preparedness is about being ready to respond, mitigation is about advanced work that can reduce the damages from an incident.
So a smoke detector is mitigation, but a burns first aid kit is preparedness. This could be a little woolly to most people. I don't think it's really a big deal. I think some things are clearly mitigation.
Response is what we do during an incident.
He's not going to say this, but each phase can be very, very, very long or very, very, very short and mixed around. Do not expect to prepare, respond and recover from events in a linear manner. Another event can occur during a disaster, and also they can alter during the recovery or during the actual response phases. Don't assume. If you have an earthquake and you're ready for an earthquake and you prep for it, and the earthquake happens and the house next door catches fire and it's very windy, you might now be finding yourselves dealing with the aftermath of an earthquake and fire. Don't expect things to go the way you hope they will go.
Response is what occurs during the heat of the moment as the incident is unfolding, as we put into practice the plans that we have developed.
Sounds good, but you need to know what to do and to be able to do it.
Recovery is moving forward after the incident. This does not mean that everything will be the same.
So building back better is actually a good idea. Recover by improving what was destroyed or damaged to make it more prepared to mitigate the next event. Promising we will rebuild is a terrible thing to say. People have died, there's been buildings destroyed, lots of livestock, lots of wildlife is dead. And your only response to it is, oh well, let's rebuild it like it was before because we're not going to allow this to alter how we live and work here. Whereas a true preparedness individual would look at that and go, okay, how can we alter the structure of the roads? How can we alter the structure of the farm areas? How can we alter the flow of the water into this area to reduce the likelihood and the effect of that event happening here ever again?
One thing that emergency managers emphasize is that recovery planning should begin before the incident. Let me pose the question, what would you think about if a tsunami damaged your property and forced you to relocate for a lengthy period of time? What would be the main challenges and needs? These are questions that shape recovery, and we'll turn to them in a future lecture.
To be frank, if a tsunami affects me here, the world's ended. To actually reach me, I'm about 800 miles from an ocean. There are some big lakes near me, but to be frank, a tsunami hitting this house, it would be an apocalyptic event. That doesn't mean to say I don't travel sometimes. Doesn't mean to say that if I'm in downtown Toronto or in Montreal, I might want to think about the signs of a tsunami and the actions to take immediately if a tsunami seems likely. If there's a big earthquake, I might just evacuate the downtown areas because a lot of them are low-lying. Just in case, you can have tsunamis on Lake Ontario and on Lake Erie. Well, that's it for the first half of this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it, lecture 3. I will be back next week, hopefully, with the internet functioning. Hopefully, me and Wolfie will come here and we will talk again about the lecture and what we felt about it. So the back half is actually more interesting than the first half to some degree, but you'll have to trust me on that and stay tuned and watch next week. This has been a 2021 Wolfie Terrier production.